Hey everyone! Hopefully you're already attending our weekly live stream, Wine Wednesday with the Whisperer, where we cover all of the important topics to seahorse keepers, breeders, and everyone in between. But we do understand that sometimes you need the information quickly instead of sitting through a 2-hour live stream. So today we start recap videos. We will provide the link to the full Wine Wednesday episode in the comment section in case you want the full experience with more information. But let's jump right into the recap of this very important topic.
What I'm going to talk about this evening is cycling a seahorse tank. The process for cycling a seahorse tank is much the same as cycling any other tank, but I'm going to go over some nuances and probably give you a little bit of information that some people may not be aware of. Um, First of all, I'm not going to go too deep into the process. Most people, you should look up how a tank is cycled and understand the very basics of the nitrogen cycle. Food is put into the tank, it's consumed by the animals. Um, in our case, we're targeting the seahorses, but there's other things in the tank that will consume the food as well. It converts it into waste products, which equals, in the end, ammonia. And then there's nitrifying bacteria that convert that ammonia over to nitrite, and then another set of nitrifying bacteria that convert it to nitrate. And then it's used by plants. It's also reduced by water changes or through denitrification. Um, there's three basic ways to cycle a tank. One is with fish, another is adding food to the tank, and then of course, what I'm going to talk about mostly this evening is the fishless or using ammonia to cycle the tank. Um, a lot of people do use fish. Most of the time you'll see damsels used. Um, there's a lot of people that consider this to be inhumane. I don't like doing it. I don't like subjecting the animals to it. I also don't like the possibility of adding pathogens to the tank. And then, of course, sometimes, depending upon how many seahorses you're adding to the tank, it may not be cycled enough for the needs of the seahorses. Um, Using food, the problem with that is that in order for food to turn into ammonia, it first has to be eaten. Something in the tank has to consume it. It doesn't just melt or just rot away. There's actually organisms in there that's eating that food, which means you've got a microbial population there eating it, and that that may or may not be a good population that's consuming the food. And then, of course, the other thing about it is it's not measurable. By using ammonia, it's clean, it's controllable, measurable, and it's actually much faster if it's done correctly. Um, and it's the food, more specifically, the metabolism of the protein that actually produces the ammonia. And that's important because if we know the protein content and how much we're putting in there, we can actually calculate out how much ammonia is going to be put into the tank and how much we need to cycle the ammonia for. In the case for seahorses, 1 cube of mysis equals roughly 27 milligrams of ammonia. And that's pretty much through any of the different brands that you buy. If you sit down and calculate it out, it's going to be within a milligram or two of that number. A 30-gallon tank, which equals, I'm sorry, a 30-gallon tank with a pair of seahorses fed 1 cube of mysis 3 times a day equals roughly 81 milligrams of ammonia. So if you have a 30-gallon tank, which converts to 114 liters, that means 81 milligrams is less than 1 part per million of ammonia per day in that tank. And the formula will actually carry over. It's take a 50-gallon tank with 4 seahorses fed 6 cubes. That's 162 milligrams of ammonia. It's still less than 1 part per million. And if you go with a normal stocking density of 25 to 30 gallons per pair of seahorses, you'll still stay within that 1 part per million if you're feeding, 1 cube per pair 3 times a day. And I point this out, and the reason I do is that when people cycle, they often use too high of a level of ammonia. In the case of a seahorse tank, if all we need is 1 part per million, it's kind of a waste to go to 5 or 10 parts per million with the ammonia level. The tank will cycle faster with a lower level. And if we understand all of this, we can be much more precise and much faster or quicker in cycling the tank. Now, the other thing I want to point out is the molecular weight of ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. They're all different. And the reason that's important is that when you sit there and look at the ammonia cycle, once it's once you have ammonia and it's converted to nitrite, it actually raises the nitrite level. It goes from 1 part per million of ammonia converts to 2.7 parts per million of nitrite, and ultimately 3.6 parts per millions of nitrate. And I'm going to be coming back to that in a couple of minutes. The nitrifying bacteria, in the case of salt water, we have nitrosococcus that converts the ammonia to nitrite, and nitrococcus, which converts nitrite to nitrate. Um, Nitrosococcus can double its population roughly under ideal conditions every 7 hours, but it can take up to 20 hours in a little bit longer, uh, less than optimal conditions. However, the nitrococcus can double the population every 13 to 15 hours in optimal conditions, but can take up to 150 hours. And that's important to understand because this is where a lot of people run into a stall or a problem with their cycling is when they get to the nitrites. Um, Now, the way that I cycle a tank is the very first thing, of course, is the tank is set up and it's running and everything is, going along as it should be. I check the pH. Ideally, I want that between 8 to 8.3. I normally up the temperature of the tank to about somewhere in the low 80s, 82, 84, somewhere in that range to speed up the process. Make the salinity that what I'm going to be running the tank at. And I also check and make sure there's no ammonia or nitrite in the tank before I get started. Um, the other thing is if you're using tap water or anything like that, you should check and make sure you don't have any um, um,
Chlorine.
chlorine or chloramines in the tank. Now, first thing I do is I add the ammonia to the tank and bring it to 1 part per million. And the ammonia that I use is typically, I go to Ace Hardware or True Value and get the janitorial strength ammonia, which is just plain, clear, unscented ammonia. It's 10% ammonia, which means it's got 100 milligrams per ml, which makes it very easy for me to measure. Now, if you go to the store, you can buy just off the shelf ammonia as long as it's clear and unscented. And it will typically in a grocery store, you'll find it's usually around 2 or 3% or something like that. And it's going to be hard to calculate because they usually won't have the numbers on the bottle. So you just add small amounts, wait 20 minutes, check your ammonia level. And usually I tell people to start do it at 1 ml at a time and keep doing that till you get to 1 part per million or 1 milligram per liter. And then write down how much that is. So the next time you've got to add it, you already know how much to add. Now, sometimes in the stores, you'll find some that have surfactants in it. Surfactants are typically used in aquaculture to decrease the surface tension. There's a lot of people that get upset with that in the ammonia. I've never worried about it. In fact, the USDA, when they buy their ammonia, they go to the grocery store and buy whatever the cheapest is on the shelf, whether it has surfactants or not, and they use that for their studies. Um, if you want to get real specific and get something that's real pure, you can always go to Dr. Tim's. He's got the ammonia chloride, which you can buy, but it's much cheaper just to run down to the store and get something that's a couple bucks a bottle. Um, Once I've added the ammonia, I want to wait for it to go to zero. And once it gets down to zero, I will then test for nitrite. I do not add ammonia at this point. I'm just testing for my nitrites and I'm watching my nitrite levels. The reason for this is, again, 1 part per million of ammonia is going to equal 2.7 parts per million of the nitrite. And the nitrite nitrifiers take at least 2 times longer to or double the amount of time for the ammonia nitrifiers. And if our nitrite level gets too high, it's going to stall the whole cycle process. So I wait for it to go to 0 parts per million. Once it gets to zero, I then add the ammonia again at 1 part per million. And then I'm going to keep repeating this process until I get to 1 part per million of ammonia going through the whole process in less than 24 hours. Once I've done that, my tank is now ready to biologically sustain the fish. Now, normally when I'm cycling my systems, starting from scratch with a sterile system, I can normally cycle it in 2 to 3 weeks using the above process. Now, there's another way to speed up the whole process, and that is to use live bacteria. Fritzyme, TurboStart, a lot of people use in the salt in the hobby. Dr. Tim's One and Only is a very good product as well. There's a bunch of other products out there, but these two actually have live bacteria and are easily accessible and within reason if you're in a hurry to cycle a tank. Another way to do it is to use pre-cycled media from an existing tank or media that's been cycled separately. I've never used media from an existing tank. I always like to start clean. I have set up bins where I have media that's constantly cycling separately so that I can instantly start up a tank. Um, if you put one of those, whether you're taking media from a different tank or pre-cycled media, you should challenge the tank. Or if your tank has been up running for a period of time, sometimes, for example, I had a customer today, not today, this week, that had a tank that had been running for a couple of months and she wanted to add some seahorses. So I had her challenge the tank. And this is done to verify the tank is cycled to handle the load that you're going to be putting in the tank. Same process, you add ammonia, 1 part per million, see if it goes through the whole process in 24 hours. If it does, you're ready. If it doesn't, then you want to complete, continue doing that until it does it within 24 hours. Sometimes I'll get people call me up and they put too much ammonia in the tank. If you do that, the solution is rather easy. You simply change the water, reduce it down to the proper level, and continue onward. If the nitrites get high, this can happen when people continuously add ammonia and they don't wait for the nitrites to go down. If you're adding ammonia and you're adding 1 part per million and you do that every day, every time the ammonia goes down, if your nitrites aren't cycling, they're going to quickly go off the chart. And you'll find that it will cycle much faster if you keep the nitrites down around 5 parts per million. And the solution there is to simply do a water change and reduce it down. If the cycle stalls, you want to check your parameters, especially your pH. And I would do a large water change and then start over and continue with the cycling process. A lot of times your bacteria has consumed your buffers in the water, and the easy solution, you can add buffer or a large water change will put the stuff back in the water that they need to continue their processes. To speed up the cycle, um, as I said before, you can increase the temperature. Interestingly, I found that when I increase the surface area of my biological media, it cycles faster. Add buffer as you're going, or add live bacteria. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. So I have a couple of questions really quick, and then we're going to jump to the questions in the comment section. And anybody in here who wants to chat, share, or has questions. But um, can you talk a little bit about what happens with the nitrite stall? Like
In
how,
respect to,
like it when if someone's adding ammonia and they add more ammonia before they're testing their nitrate levels, because this happened to me and I remember you had to work it out for me, but I'm just wondering if you can describe like what usually happens when the nitrite stalls the cycle, or
well,
it stalled because, sorry, go ahead.
well, what normally happens, if you watch the advice of most people on the internet, they'll tell you to keep adding ammonia. Every time it drops, add ammonia.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are trying to cycle with higher amounts. So for example, if somebody's trying to get up around 5 parts per million and they're not letting the nitrites come down, well, that 5 parts per million is going to convert over to well over 10 parts per million of nitrites.
Ooh.
And they do that multiple times. The next thing you know, the nitrites are just not only off the chart, but they're sky high. And when that happens, the too high of a nitrite level actually um, it, it's almost like a toxic thing to the nitrifying bacteria, and it just simply stalls. And
Never
until it comes
converts.
down, yeah, it's just going to take a long, long time for it to eventually come down.
And I point that out because, unfortunately, in my case, it was a situation where I thought I had the tank cycled. I made the errors he's describing, and I actually had seahorses in the tank, and my nitrites were off the chart. And it's very bad for seahorses to have nitrites off the chart. So I had to
Yes.
do some emergency actions there, and literally hospital tank and all this other craziness just to get the tank back in shape for the seahorses. So, really important to make sure that you do it right the first time, get it truly cycled, and not try to rush through it. You can convert how much food equals ammonia and etc., but you're still saying don't use food to cycle the tank because of you never know what organisms are eating it. Was that the main point? Like you're talking like ciliates and all that crap?
Yeah, you're going to have protozoans and bacteria that convert the food over. They're going to eat the food and turn it into ammonia. And I don't want to already have a tank full of ciliates uh, or various protozoans, or some cases, the bacteria can be any number of species that convert. And some people don't realize it, but some of your Vibrio bacteria can actually act as nitrifiers.
Yeah.
And it's just to me, it's good practice to start with a clean tank. Um, and if you look at how some people do it, they take a big old piece of shrimp
Yep.
and just dump it in there. Well, that's a lot of stuff sitting there just rotting away. And the other thing is, you really have no control over the process at that point, and you're going to have huge spikes, and it's going to take longer for that process to ultimately work.
So one thing that I see people doing wrong, you mentioned on our phone call that you've seen people that literally think if they just let their tank sit for a month, then it's cycled, and they didn't understand the feeding of the ammonia, or I always say feeding, guys, I'm not sciencey, but the cycling it, you have to actually do something to make it cycled. It can't just sit. But one of the other things that I see people do is they'll follow your instructions exactly. They'll use ammonia to cycle the tank. They'll have it all ready, but then they're not getting their seahorses for another month. So can you talk a little bit about what you're supposed to do if you cycle it? It's perfect. Then what are you supposed to do between the time it's become cycled and you actually get the seahorses?
Great question. First of all, the tank that's been sitting for a while, the tank at that point may be cycled, but it may not be cycled to the level that'll handle the bioload from the seahorses. So some people do like to set up their tanks and let them mature, and there's nothing wrong with that. Before adding the seahorses, though, I would challenge the system and then um, see if it handles it or not. And it may take 2 or 3 cycles of added ammonia to bring it up to speed. It'll usually come up to speed very, very quickly if that is the case. If you, in the case where you've gone through the process, the tank is cycled, and now you're waiting on the seahorses, if you're talking about a week or something, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're talking a month or so, then I would probably do the ammonia once or twice a week just to keep it in shape until the seahorses come.
Don't use the dirty shrimp method. Don't do it.
What happened?
I did that. And it took, instead of probably taking my tank 6 weeks maybe to cycle and be totally secure about it,
Yep.
it took me like 3 months. And my nitrites were off the charts for months. So fortunately, after that, I was able to find Dr. Tim's the ammonia and everything. I just was impatient and I listened to stupid stuff I found. So I think that this video, because I think a lot of people that are looking to start seahorse tanks find your information first, Kelly, because you're the seahorse whisperer. So I think this is going to be a great video. I think maybe you should pin it to your Facebook.
Kevin, did you have anything to add? Any questions or anything you wanted to share today?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a couple of things on all of those points. So the act of having cycled a tank doesn't mean that it is currently cycling. So at one point you might have put the ammonia in, it might have converted to nitrite and nitrate. and the bacteria that are responsible for that process would have grown to an extent that it could take that ammonia and change it. And if you do not continue to add the ammonia, if you have a display tank with live animals, you have that waste product constantly being added. But if you have any sort of media or anything with any surface area on it, there are bacteria growing on that. You need to continuously feed that if you want it to be actively cycling. Something might have cycled, but it doesn't mean it has the capacity. So that goes to Dan's point of challenging that system to see if it's still capable or if you can re-amplify those bacteria by feeding them once again. And whether it's K1 media, that's a trade brand name, or anything, even a protein skimmer, a sponge, like Dan said, even the plumbing, the inside of your plumbing, anything that is touching the water is a biological filter. And so something that I see people kind of get frustrated with is they might have an established tank, whether it's Seahorses or a normal display tank, and they remove something. They remove a pump, or they remove a skimmer, or they might change the decor, or change some live rock, and you're physically removing that bacteria that had established in that system, and removing it. The bacteria is on that object, whatever you're removing, and so now your capacity of your system isn't able to potentially stay up with that bio load that it had. So the bacteria elsewhere in the system needs to grow to kind of maintain what was that nitrogen cycle. And so you can always add media, whether it's plastic pellets, bio balls, or sponges, or whatever, to help give more space, more physical space for that bacteria to grow on, so that if you do have a fluctuation in bio load, or if you do want to ramp up your bacteria to be able to hold 2 or 3 or 4 seahorses right off the bat, you can do that. Just keep in mind, that's why some people have a 20 or 30 gallon display, but a 50 or 60 gallon sump with a whole bunch of stuff in it, so that they can have that additional surface area. So if you do take something out of your system, definitely start testing for ammonia and nitrite again, just so that you can make sure that you're not going to endanger the animals' well-being. They can burn their gills quite easily, and so that once you go through that cycle again, because you'll have a little bump, because your bacteria will have to adapt.
I'd also like to point out that a lot of people don't seem to realize that the nitrifying bacteria are, as Kevin was pointing out, their own surfaces, and they form biofilms, and that's where they are. They're not in the water column per se.
Right.
There may be some strays in the water column, but they don't inhabit the water column. And taking water from a cycle tank and putting it in another tank does not really speed up the cycle. You need to take something that has surface area and put it in the other tank to speed up that cycling process.
I've seen a lot of times when people move, like rearrange their tank. Let's say someone has a tank without a sump even, and their only biological filter is the rock. If they move that rock around, they seem to always have problems right afterwards. Is this related or nah?
You can be disturbing a lot of things, whether it's any anaerobic conditions that might be under the decor or the rock or in the sand. Then you have mechanical irritation from the debris floating around that can irritate the gills. Seahorses especially are very, very easily disturbed mechanically, especially their snouts or anything that might be floating in the water column. And if it's moving, they might try to eat it and damage internal gills. And so there's, if you want to go bare bottom, we can have this discussion, this sandy bottom versus bare bottom discussion. But just be mindful that if you disturb anything, you could be disturbing, all sorts of things in addition to the bacteria.
Most of your biological material, you're probably not going to destroy that just by moving stuff. But my thought process was the same, that you're going to kick other stuff up. In most tanks, people have, it was pointed out earlier, is that every surface area in the tank is a surface area for the bacteria to grow on. And a lot of us have sumps and what have you. In my systems, I could strip the tank completely bare, scrub it down, fill it back up with water, but I still got my sump that's fully cycled, and I wouldn't have an issue. If you're running a display tank without a sump, you got to be careful. Where I see people have the biggest problems are people that are relying on canisters or hang on the back filters for their biological they take them apart and clean them and put them back in place, well, they've destroyed most of their nitrifying bacteria in the process.
Absolutely. Especially with a seahorse tank where you don't have a bunch of rock in the tank. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Dylan's little hubby asked, is there any difference in cycling a seahorse tank versus a normal saltwater tank or a reef or even freshwater tank?
Not really. I mean, it's basically the same process. I mean, one could argue that you may need more or less ammonia to do it, depending upon what you're putting in the tank. Um, but it's still, cycling is cycling, whether it's freshwater or saltwater. It's different species of bacteria, but otherwise still the same process.
You don't like people have asked me before, can I have my cleanup crew in the tank while I'm cycling with ammonia? No. Any other thoughts on that, guys? Go ahead.
Now, I don't recommend having anything in the tank while you're doing the ammonia. And the ammonia, I understand where some people are shy from it, but chemically, it's basically the same thing as what the fish are producing. So, it's really not as big of a deal as you may think, provided you go through the process and you've got the tank cycled and there's no ammonia in the tank when you put the fish in. Ammonia is a gas, and it's going to turn into a gas in the end anyway. But once it's gone through that process, there's really nothing to be concerned about. As long as you're not buying ammonia that has detergents, added detergents and fragrances and things like that in it. If it's clear, unscented ammonia, you'll probably be fine.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of ways to end up being successful. I think we're talking about the best ways here. Oops, I muted myself. We saw a tank from Joe Iulo in the past, and Richard Ross about being lazy reefers. And so there's a lot of ways to come to it. But what you don't want is all this inadvertent biological load because you have all of these organics in your system festering and rotting away. And so, yeah, if you have flake food, that's one way to accomplish it. But you're going to be promoting all sorts of other things growing in your system, and you might have additional problems down the line. And so I think most of us who are interested in keeping marine aquariums have within 15 miles of us a store that you can get ammonia from. Yeah, and that's the thing. People might end up saying that their tank then is successfully cycled at the end of that. And to Dan's point, and to everyone else should know that just because you can get that 1 part per million ammonia through all the way to nitrate, and that works for seahorses if you're keeping a couple. Dan gave those equations per seahorse per tank per day earlier on. Go back and look at that and adjust that to your system, because that's just to get your tank started, and you're going to ramp this up, and as you add more stuff, your bacteria are going to spread onto that. But yeah, you don't want to be, you can put other things in there, but please just take the simple route and just put in what the bacteria need and not too much else.
How many people do use the good like Dr. Tim's or Fritz, to help the cycle along? And I'm curious, like, if you're using that, which I've done it, but how does that affect ammonia cycling? When would you put it in? How would it help or not?
And I've never used Dr. Tim's, but I've used Fritz, and I've used some other commercial products that were essentially the same thing as the Fritz Turbozyme. And I've done it where I've taken a system, and you got to remember, I'm doing a lot more seahorses at a time when I do it, but I've taken a sterile system that's just been bleached and brought back up, added the live bacteria and added the fish the same day. Not the way I like to do it, because I don't have no guarantees. Occasionally, I find that some of these bottled bacterias, they almost always handle the ammonia just fine, but I've had several times where they didn't handle the nitrites. And it took time to get the nitrifying bacteria for the nitrites into place. And it meant extra work to keep everything at bay until they did catch up. Um, so I'd much rather prefer to add the bacteria before adding the fish and being able to check it and make sure that it's adequate. You can add the bacteria at the beginning, or you can add it after you've started the process. If it was me, if I had the bacteria on hand, I would add the bacteria, I would add my ammonia, and then I would proceed onward through the process to see that it's cycling the way I want it to.
And for the record, I think in previous episodes I've talked about it, but this time I promise I'm gonna link the article from Dr. Timms that actually walks you through with his particular brand. He literally gives you a step by step, day by day. You know, when you should add this, when you should add that. So if you're going to use it, I'd say follow the man who made it. But
So we're talking like, 40 days of ammonia, 40 tests of ammonia. We're talking like maybe 30 or 28 nitrate and nitrite tests here, over this entire cycling period. So when you're going into setting up a new tank, you don't have those test kits and the capability of doing that many tests. Potentially just keep that in mind, because you might not be testing for nitrite, but you might see your ammonia disappear, and you want to make sure that that nitrite is building or it gets passed on to nitrate. We should be testing all three once you see your ammonia going down, because the bacteria will continue to grow.
If you have a cycle tank and all of a sudden you see 0.25 ammonia, do you guys freak out, or what do you do?
I don't freak out at 0.25 of ammonia, but I'm paying attention. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to observe the fish. Second thing, I'm going to go back and test it again. And then I'm going to follow up with another test to see if it's coming up or going back down. 0.25 is not going to do your tank in, but it's not something I want to stay at that level.
Thought process, guys, on when you do cycle a tank with dry, because I wasn't prepared. I'll tell you, when I got into Seahorses, and Dan and Cheryl and everyone and Ray taught me that it's better to start with dry, only because you avoid hitchhikers and you don't have as many algae problems. I started with dry, and it took me so much longer to cycle. I mean, it was unreal. I mean, obviously it makes sense because when you have live rock, it's already got the bacteria, blah, blah, blah. But I couldn't believe how long it took me to cycle dry rock. And it was
You're
man-made,
right,
but
Kelly.
go
My
ahead.
first Seahorse tank, I used dry rock and had to cure it myself. And you're right, it took forever and a day.
Thoughts, guys?
If
Yeah,
you're
but
taking,
that's where ammonia and nitrifying bacteria come in. You can do a tank if you really want to work at it. You can get a tank up and running in a couple of weeks without any trouble, starting from scratch with all dry rock, no sand, just using the ammonia and the nitrifying bacteria. So you can do it very rapidly.
the shortest I've ever cycled a tank using everything starting sterile, going from zero, nothing, and to have the tank running fully cycled was 2 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
that was without using bacteria. That was just using ammonia with the method that I described.
After today, if you watch this video later and you have questions, comment them. We see them. I'll make sure they get answered. Just make sure to comment and we'll answer any questions that weren't covered.
Night.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Happy Wine Wednesday. See you next week. Cheers.